So sometime in the late 1580s, Shakespeare heads to London and finds himself a job in the theatrical profession. So what was the state of the theatre when he arrived on the London scene? Well, it was a fascinating time. Purpose-built playhouses, putting on plays all the year round to the public, charging an entrance fee. These were brand new things in Elizabethan England. The professional entertainment industry was taking off for the first time. But the City of London was dominated by strongly Protestant figures, businessmen, sometimes Puritan in their belief. They didn't like theatre for many reasons. For one thing, once plays were put on in the afternoons, apprentices and workers would maybe go out to lunch, have a few drinks, take the afternoon off and not come back. So the Puritan city fathers didn't allow the presence of fixed theatres in the heart of the City of London. It pushed the theatres out to the suburbs. Some were in the East End, places like Shoreditch, but most of the theatres were in Southwark, on the south bank of the River Thames. The River Thames dominated London, and there was only one bridge across it. And what we're looking at here is a fantastic coloured map from the collections of the Shakespeare Birthplace Trust here in Stratford. A map by a man called John Norden showing London Bridge, which, as you can see, at the time had houses and shops on it. In order to get to the theatre on the South Bank, you either had to take one of these boats or to walk across the bridge. Norden's map is rather wonderful in its almost comical detail. There are a couple of people who seem to have fallen out of their boat. There's also, though, a more sinister detail. As you get to the south end of London Bridge, you can see on the gatehouse, up on poles, the severed heads of traitors. They were there as a reminder to the people of London to remain obedient to Queen and Parliament. It's an amazing thought that as you walked across London Bridge to go to the Rose or later the Globe Theatre, where you might see a play about kings and queens being dethroned, about crowds rioting, that you would have actually passed through that gatehouse where you would have seen the severed heads of real figures who had engaged in that same kind of activity. The theatre, a place where the big political and social issues of the day were explored. It was highly dangerous. For that reason, all plays had to be read by the office of the Lord Chamberlain, who was the official of the court in charge of public entertainment and royal entertainment. Because that was the other aspect of the theatre. The acting companies not only made their money at the box office, they also made it from command performances at the royal court. So Shakespeare knew, whenever he was writing, that he had to keep in mind different sorts of audience. The ordinary people of London, those who would have walked over the bridge or taken a boat across the river and paid their penny to see the show, but also the royal family, the diplomats, the aristocrats who would have seen the special performances at court. And of course, that's one of the reasons why Shakespeare's plays have this extraordinary mixture of high-class characters and low. A Midsummer Night's Dream is a great example of that. A really good technique of beginning to think about any Shakespeare play is just to look at the list of the characters at the front of it and to think about how you would divide them into groups. In the case of Midsummer Night's Dream, you immediately see you get the Duke, Theseus, his queen, Hippolyta. That's the royal court. You then get the well-to-do characters, the gentry, as we might say, Demetrius, Lysander, the lovers. And then you get the so-called rude mechanicals, the working men who put on the play. And there must be a bit of a joke on behalf of Shakespeare's acting company, because of course they were regarded as inferior characters themselves in London society, working men, not upper class at all, and yet through the theatre they got the opportunity to impersonate the upper classes, to put on the robes of kings and queens and dukes. So you went over London Bridge and there were the playhouses. They were polygonal buildings. In some of the early drawings they looked like circular. What was the interior of the theatre like though? Well, we've got evidence from things like building contracts which give us an idea of the dimensions. But we only have one drawing of the interior of an Elizabethan theatre. It's a drawing of a theatre called the Swan. I've got a copy of it here. We have to put a bit of a health warning on this because it's actually a copy. What happened was a visiting Dutchman called Johannes de Witt sent a letter to a friend back in Holland describing the theatre with a drawing, and then his friend copied it. But we know from other drawings by the friend that he wasn't very good at perspective, so I suspect that some of the dimensions and details and perspectives are not quite right in this. However, it's all we've got, and it certainly gives us an idea of the shape of the theatre. When Shakespeare's Globe Theatre was being reconstructed for the new Globe on Bankside, this drawing was very much the model that was used. So what we see is a large area in the foreground. This was known as the yard or the pit. It was the place where people stood. They paid a penny and stood quite close to the stage. They were actually known as groundlings. Hamlet refers to them as gentlemen of the ground. A groundling was in fact a type of small fish that would rise up to the surface and open its mouth. And that suggests the idea of the groundlings, the people who have paid a penny, standing, gaping, open-mouthed up at the wonders of the world they were seeing on the stage. The stage then was quite high with the people standing around it. But if you had a little bit more money, if you were a little bit more upper class, you could pay for a seat and a cushion, and importantly, given what the British weather is like, to be covered. So one can see round the edges of the drawing 3 layers of the gallery, which was the more expensive and seated part of the audience. Half of the stage is covered by a canopy, and that canopy would have been beautifully decorated with signs of the zodiac. At the back of the stage are a couple of doors, and we know from the stage directions in many of Shakespeare's plays that often he uses the device of having different people coming on at the opposite doors either side of the stage. You can get a very good stage tableau, a sense of opposite forces, maybe 2 different armies, one coming through each door. Above, there is a raised area which we can again tell from things like stage directions was sometimes used for scenes in which people would speak at a window. The most famous example, of course, is the scene in Romeo and Juliet, where Juliet is at her window and Romeo is in the orchard below. We sometimes think of that as Juliet's balcony, but actually Shakespeare nowhere in Romeo and Juliet refers to a balcony. A balcony was introduced about 150 years later on the 18th century stage. It was a window in Shakespeare's theatre. At the very top, there's a flag. This theatre was the Swan, so it's got a picture of the Swan. Shakespeare's, of course, was the Globe, would have had a picture of the Globe. And you can also see a herald there with a trumpet. What would happen is when the play was going to begin, the trumpet would be sounded 3 times, so people could come in from the taverns or the streets and witness the beginning of the play. But although the dimensions may be slightly questionable, the thing that the Swan drawing crucially shows us is that this is an open stage. It's a flat platform. There is no proscenium arch. It's not like those later theatres of the 18th, 19th, 20th century, where there's an archway and a curtain, where the world of the play, of the actors, is divided from the world of the audience. This is a one-room outdoor theatre, a place where the actors and the audience share the same space. When an actor on the Shakespearean stage is alone, we say he or she is speaking a soliloquy, voicing their thoughts, speaking to themselves. But they're not only speaking to themselves, they're also speaking to the audience. The audience are incredibly close. There is an openness, and the audience are looking from different angles. It's theatre in the round. There's no single perspective. There's a multiplicity of angles, a multiplicity of voices, just as there's a multiplicity of characters from different social classes.